Okay, so this is the Bible study for 1 Samuel chapter 17, 31 through 58 for the second part of the Bible study. Now, this was a 2-week Bible study, so the first week began the story in verses 1 through 30, and this is going to finish the story in verses 31 through 58. But if you weren't with us in the first half, or it's been too long and you don't remember, you might go ahead and read the first 30 verses of chapter 17 just to make sure that the story is connected in your mind. But the text beginning in 31 says, "What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, 'Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him.' Saul replied, 'You are not able to go against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth.' But David said to Saul, 'Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off the sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine.' Saul said to David, 'Go, and the Lord be with you.' Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. 'I cannot go in these,' he said to Saul, 'because I'm not used to them.' So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, 'Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?' And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. 'Come here,' he said, 'and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals.' David said to the Philistine, 'You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands.' As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn along the Sherim road to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem. He put the Philistine's weapon in his own tent. As Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, commander of his army, 'Abner, whose son is that young man?' Abner replied, 'As surely as you live, your majesty, I don't know.' The king said, 'Find out whose son this young man is.' As soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with David still holding the Philistine's head. 'Whose son are you, young man?' David said, I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem. Okay. So we talked about the beginning of this Bible study. So if you download this at www.abqnaz.org/alive, you can download a PDF copy of this Bible study. And since this is a 2-week Bible study, the Bible study will that you download will be all of chapter 17, 1 Samuel chapter 17. But on the second page of it, if you scroll down, you'll find this particular Bible study. And it says what happened in verse 31. In verse 31, remember that this Philistine, Goliath, had been coming out to defy the armies of Israel every day for 40 days. We talked about the number 40 and what that means. And so he had been coming out every day, and the army was in fear, but David came. And what was going on just before this text was that he was hearing from the army what would be done for somebody that killed this Philistine. And of course, his brother Eliab was upset because he was just coming out to watch the battle and wasn't really going to do anything, and was all wrapped up in the drama, it seems, and excited about the battle, but not really being of help. Which is obviously not the heart of David, given what happens next. So what happened in verse 31, it says, what David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. So in other words, they realized that everybody else was sort of just gossiping about what would be done for somebody who killed this Philistine. They're looking for anybody who'd be willing. So as soon as somebody starts asking questions and saying, wait, what will be done? Then all of a sudden they realize there's some interest, and they go tell Saul, hey, there's a kid out there and he's asking questions about what will be done for somebody to go fight the Philistine. So he was brought before Saul. Now, I don't know if they told him how young he was or how small he was. Or that he wasn't even a soldier. I don't know if any of that got passed on to Saul, but it may have been that they were just so excited that anybody was showing interest in fighting Goliath that they didn't care, and they sent him to Saul. So the second part of number 11 says, what does David say to Saul in verse 32? He says, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. So he's telling Saul, I'm going to go fight him. Don't let anybody else be discouraged. Don't worry. I'll take care of it. And that had to be almost humorous for Saul, looking at this young kid who says he's going to go fight, this is what he said. What was Saul's response? Saul replied, you are not able to go fight against the Philistine. You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior since his youth. So you're no match for this guy. I'm not going to send a kid out here to fight somebody that is going to kill him. And that was basically Saul's response. It had to be funny to him almost that David would be willing to fight. You know how kids say stuff because they don't understand how the world works, and they don't understand, how dangerous something is. And everything looks just so simple to a kid. But there's something about what David is saying. He's not naive. He's not being silly. There's something real here. So number 12 says, what does David say to try to convince Saul that he can defeat Goliath, according to verses 34 through 37? He says, I've been keeping my father's sheep, and when I'm out there, bears and lions show up. And when bears and lions show up, there's nobody else to defend the sheep but me. And if that bear comes and gets the sheep, I'm going and getting him. And I've grabbed that thing by the hair, and I've killed that thing to protect my sheep. And all of a sudden, something has to be saying to Saul, this kid's serious. Maybe he is able to do something that nobody else thinks they can do. So the second part says, how did Saul respond after that, according to 37b? Saul said to David, go and the Lord be with you. Now, at this point, I don't know if Saul really thinks he can win, or if Saul just says, what do we got to lose? This kid's serious. I might as well let him go out. He may get killed, but we've been standing here listening to this Philistine defy us all these days now. Maybe there's an opportunity here. So number 13 says, what does Saul do in verses 38 and 39? So then he dressed him in his armor and fastened his sword over the tunic. So he said, okay, you're going to go fight. Let's put the armor of a warrior on you. Saul obviously was large, and he put it on him. And then it says, what did David do in 39b and 40? David says, I cannot go in these because I'm not used to them. So he took them off. He took a staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd bag, and went with a sling in his hand and approached the Philistine. So now, I think this is really more significant than we realize. I was reading a book that's actually a secular book. It's not even a Christian book. I don't even think that the guy that wrote it is technically a Christian. I think he was raised in the church and has some understanding of Christian doctrine and background, but I don't believe that he's actually a Christian. And I was reading this book, and one of the things that he pointed out, so in other words, this isn't a commentary, this isn't spiritual insight per se, but I actually do think that it's good insight and interpretation on this text. And he was using it as a secular analogy for life, and saying that a lot of Christians think that the miracle of David and Goliath is that the small beat the big. That's the lesson to be learned, that God empowered the small to beat the big. But and again, this is secular insight, so it may be trying to minimize God in the situation, but I don't think it does minimize God. I think we can think about this concept and still believe that God enabled it all. But he said the miracle, or the important point of this text, is that David didn't fight Goliath on his terms. That David didn't fight Goliath in Saul's armor. That David knew that he was at a disadvantage if he went in full armor with all the weight of that. That basically he was going to fight Goliath on his terms if he did that, and David would lose every time fighting on Goliath's terms. But you read in the first part of this text, in last week's Bible study, in the first 30 verses, how much Goliath's armor weighed. So if they're going to go out and fight one-on-one, a battle of strength with spear and sword and armor, face to face, David's going to lose. But the moment that David doesn't have any of that weight, the moment that David can sort of, bob and weave, if it was a boxing match, the moment that David can run towards Goliath is not doing any running. Goliath at the age of 40, which it was probably felt older then than it even does now, I imagine. I don't know. But if Goliath at that age and with that much weight on him, if somebody runs at him, there's nothing that he can do. He can't respond fast enough to get to this little guy, so he can't hurt David, not because David has armor, because David is moving too fast. He can't defend himself against David's attacks because he is big and slow, and David is quick and nimble. And so the fact that David was willing to fight him and not be lured into fighting Goliath on Goliath's terms, on even ground, but rather to fight Goliath the way David was used to fighting a bear. That is a part of the story here that's important. So the fact that Saul put this armor on David, and David maybe was tempted that this is the only way, but he had the courage to stand up and say, I can't do this. This is not the way that I know how to fight. I'm going to do it my way. And I would say this, there's a lot of lessons in that for us. One is we should never fight the enemy on the enemy's terms. We're often tempted, I think, to when the enemy comes against us, to use his own tactics against him. You know, if somebody comes against us, criticizing us and tearing us down, don't we want to tear them down too? Don't we want to use the same tactics? But the person of God does not use the same tactics as the enemy. And so that's one thing. The other thing is, I think we're often sort of tempted in and lured into doing things in a way that is not set with our gifts. And one of the things that I learned when I went into ministry is that, you know, I came up under Pastor Bain's ministry, and he was a great influence on me and helped raise me up and teach me what it was to do ministry. But at some point in my life, I had to decide I have a different gift set than Pastor Bain did, and I do ministry differently. We work towards the same goal and we have the same purposes, but I don't do it the same way. And so, you know, I'm not going to put on the armor of somebody else to try to fight the battle that God's called me to fight. So there's another thought. Number 15 says, what was Goliath's response as David approached, according to verses 41 through 44? So he says, what, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? I'm going to kill you. I'm going to give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. You know, what is this? So his take is, if you don't come out with me with armor, there's no way you're going to beat me. He did not take seriously the battle tactics of David. He did not really think this was going to work. And in fact, you know, he tore him down and made fun of him for it. How did David handle Goliath's insults? According to 45 through 47, he said, no, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to kill you with your own sword. And all the armies of the Philistines are the ones that are going to be fed to the birds. There you go. So he didn't say, oh, you're right, I have no chance. That's big talk for a little boy. He said, no, that's not the way this is going to go. I'm going to kill you. How do you respond to the attacks of the enemy that is confident he can defeat you? See, the enemy that we fight, first of all, we don't fight against flesh and blood. We fight against the principalities and the powers of this dark world, right? But the enemy is confident he can defeat us. How do we respond? Do we give in? Do we believe his criticisms? Do we end up agreeing with him? Yeah, you're probably going to kill me. Or do we realize that God is with us and have confidence of our own? So the last part of this says, is this arrogant, as Eliab would have suggested? See, that's what Eliab said when David was asking questions. Well, in the end, this is probably a worldly statement, but it's only arrogance if it's not true. And I don't think that's actually true at all, because I think you can be arrogant about things that are true, but not recognize that God is in it, right? But so I don't think this is arrogance, though. Not because it was true and he could defeat him, but because I think David understood that he was fighting for the living God and that God was with him. Number 16 says, what happened in the battle according to 48 through 51? A, as the Philistine moved closer to attack, David ran toward him, slung a stone at him from a distance, hitting him in the forehead. B, the stone sank into his forehead and he fell face down on the ground. I mean, so all this weight of armor and he's knocked silly and falls face down. C, so David triumphed without a sword in his hand. So it's sunk into his forehead. It may have killed him right there. Then David took the Philistine's sword and killed him, cut off his head after he was already dead. Number 17, what happened next according to verses 51b through 53? David ran and stood over him. Let's see. When the Philistines saw their hero dead, so starting in B there, then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines. So all the Philistines turned and ran, and the Israelites pursued them and killed them along the road. So in the end, the Philistines should have been, I mean, if we're going by what Goliath said, they're now subject to him. They should have kind of knelt down and surrendered. No, they ran. So when they run, that's not the agreement. So the Israelites chase them down and continue the fight. Number 18, what do you think the moral or point of this story is? A, make sure you cut off the head. I don't think that's it. B, when everybody else is afraid, someone has to stand up for God's interest in this world. I do think there's something there. C, if God is with you, you can be successful no matter how outmatched you are. I think that's true too. D, sometimes the person that seems to have the advantage only has an advantage if you fight the way he expects. Goliath never saw the attack coming and was unprepared for that kind of fight. The story would have been very different if David had accepted Saul's armor. I think that's definitely a good point of this story, moral application. Number 19 says, do you face enemies in your life that threaten to demoralize you? Yes, we do. Sometimes they're physical enemies, and we know that the enemy is not flesh and blood, but sometimes he uses flesh and blood to fight against us. Sometimes there's things that are very real that come up against us. Many times the enemy is discouragement. The enemy is criticism. The enemy is sort of our mental and emotional health. And the enemy uses things, circumstances of our life to really get us down and put us into sort of a situation where we're frozen with fear. It says, how do you fight these battles? One, with God, it needs to be. Two, we can't fight them on the same level as the enemy. We can't fight them on his terms. We got to fight them on God's terms.